The news reached Earth like a knife in the dark. It was supposed to be nothing, a simple school trip off-world. Human children had been visiting colonies for years now, under the so-called Galactic Friendship Program. It was meant to prove that humanity could be trusted among the older races, that our children could mingle safely with theirs, and that the galaxy could finally bury its fear of us. But that trust was shattered in a single moment. The child's name was Daniel. He was 8. Curious, stubborn, and too brave for his size. His father had begged him not to go, but Daniel wanted to see the stars, wanted to step where humanity had never stepped before. The field trip was supposed to be tightly controlled, a group of human children, carefully watched by armed escorts and alien hosts. Every safety precaution promised. But when you leave your child in the hands of those who think themselves superior, there is always a chance they will show their true nature. The alien species was called the Therics. In the treaties, they were painted as allies. In truth, they were predators draped in law and bureaucracy, forever smirking at the fragile, younger race that humanity was supposed to be. Daniel was shoved. Some said it was a game. Some said it was a cultural misunderstanding. All anyone knew was that his small human body struck a wall of alien alloy with a sound no parent ever forgets. Bones snapped, blood spilled, his skull cracked open under the laughter of creatures 10 times his size. By the time the escorts reached him, Daniel was gone. Dead. The Therics explained it away with shrugs. Accident, they called it. Unfortunate. They spoke with that tone the galaxy had perfected when addressing humans, a tone that said, "You're beneath us, but we'll pretend to care." His father's name was Jonathan Hale. He was no soldier, no politician, just an engineer working in the orbital docks of Luna, designing freighters that would never carry his son again. When he received the news, his silence was more frightening than any scream. He buried his boy in the red dirt of Mars, under a sky that Daniel had once said looked like fire. Then he vanished, quit his job, sold his belongings, walked away from the neighbors who whispered pity and the officials who muttered condolences. The galaxy thought the matter was closed. One dead human child in the vastness of billions. A tragedy, but not worth more than a passing apology. But the galaxy forgot something crucial. Humanity does not forgive. Humanity does not forget. And above all else, humanity does not allow its children to be taken without consequence. 3 months later, a Therics mining vessel drifted into Sol space. It was supposed to be routine, a friendly exchange of resources. Instead, Earth responded with silence. No docking rights, no transmissions, just stillness. Then the ship was found, torn apart in the void, every Therics aboard reduced to blood and bone. The work was not crude, it was precise, surgical, a message. The humans had struck back. And though the officials of Earth denied involvement, though the diplomats begged for calm, the galaxy began to whisper a phrase that would soon echo like thunder. One human child was hurt. The galaxy will pay in blood. Jonathan Hale was not a soldier, not a killer. At least that's what he told himself when the weight of the pistol first rested in his palm. He sat alone in a rusting storage unit on the edge of Luna's abandoned dockyards, the faint hum of vacuum-sealed doors and forgotten machinery groaning around him. The pistol was standard issue, an old Earth military sidearm bought from a black market trader who didn't ask questions. He had spent 2 weeks staring at it, disassembling it, reassembling it, firing it into the empty dust fields until his hands blistered. Every man lies to himself before he changes. Jonathan Hale was no different. The Therics had called Daniel's death an accident. They had bowed their heads in mock sympathy and sent him home with a box sealed in polished alloy, a coffin too small, too cold, too final. Hale remembered the weight of that coffin, How light it had felt compared to the burden it carried. 8 years of laughter. Gone. He remembered the alien diplomat's words at the tribunal. We regret this incident, but one child, in the vastness of billions, cannot dictate policy. We move forward. They moved forward. He could not. The day after Daniel's burial, Jonathan stopped moving altogether. He sat in silence while others spoke, nodded when neighbors offered condolences, and shut his door against the world. But grief curdled in the pit of his stomach, turning into something sharper, darker. By the time he walked away from his old life, Jonathan Hale was not mourning. He was waiting. The first target was a freighter, not random, carefully chosen. It carried Therix ore through the Kuiper Belt, unguarded because treaties promised safety in Sol space. Hale had studied the flight paths for weeks, mapping the blind spots in the patrols. He didn't attack alone. Humanity is never short of broken men willing to bleed. Dock workers, retired Marines, a smuggler who had lost his wife to alien accidents. They called themselves nothing, swore no oath, wore no insignia. They were fathers, brothers, men hollowed out by loss. They boarded the freighter like shadows. The Therix crew expected humans to be predictable, diplomatic, hesitant, shackled by law. They weren't prepared for the silence of men who had nothing left to lose. Hale led them through the narrow corridors, his pistol steady, his eyes dead. He didn't kill at first. Others did. A retired Marine broke necks with bare hands. A dock worker fired wild bursts of plasma that left the walls smoking. The aliens begged, squealed, hissed their excuses. When Hale finally pulled the trigger, it was because one of them laughed, a nervous sound, sharp and ugly in the chaos. He put a bullet through the creature's skull and didn't blink as it collapsed at his feet. The freighter never reached its destination. Instead, it was found weeks later, floating in the emptiness, its crew mutilated, its cargo scattered into the void. Carved into the steel of the command deck were words written in blood. You hurt one child, we will hurt you all. The galaxy erupted in outrage. The Therix demanded justice. Other species murmured of human savagery, of the danger they had always feared. Earth's government scrambled, denying involvement, blaming rogue actors. Diplomats begged for calm, insisting humanity was not declaring war. But the galaxy had already made its choice. To them, humanity was no longer the fragile younger race. They were predators, wolves in the fold, and the wolves had tasted blood. For Jonathan, it was only the beginning. The men who followed him changed too. At first, they were fractured, just broken pieces of different tragedies, glued together by rage. But under Jonathan, they became something sharper. They trained. They shared tactics, weapons, codes. They stopped drinking to forget and started sharpening their hate into steel. One night, sitting around a fire on an abandoned Martian plane, one of the Marines asked, "What are we? Hale? Just murderers? Pirates?" Jonathan stared into the flames. "We're fathers," he said, "and fathers protect their children, even if it means burning the galaxy to ash." No one argued after that. The second strike was not a freighter. It was a colony, a small Therix outpost clinging to the edge of an asteroid belt. Barely 100 civilians, miners, families, the kind of place humanity had been told to avoid out of respect for galactic order. Hale studied their routines, the patrols, the power grid. He planned every angle with the patience of an engineer. Then, in the silence of the belt, they struck. There were no survivors. The colony burned in silence, its distress beacons jammed, its ships disabled. Hale stood on the cracked rock, watching the flames lick the skyless dark. His men moved among the wreckage, planting charges, gathering whatever spoils they could carry. One of them hesitated. A younger man, no older than Jonathan's son had been when he first learned to walk. The boy looked at a Therix child hiding in the rubble, its eyes wide, its breathing ragged. Jonathan walked over, raised his pistol, and fired. The boy flinched but said nothing. "Mercy is what they count on," Hale told him. His voice was flat, his hand steady. "If we show them mercy, they'll keep laughing at us, keep taking our children. Mercy is weakness." "And weakness is why Daniel is in the ground." The boy nodded. Later he was sick behind a boulder. But he came back. They all came back. Word spread like wildfire. Human space grew darker, sharper. Some condemned Hale. Others whispered his name with awe. On Earth, people protested in the streets, some demanding vengeance, some begging for peace. Politicians tried to keep the balance, terrified of what would happen if humanity became the monster the galaxy already feared. But in the shadows, Jonathan Hale became something more than a grieving father. He became a symbol. Alien traders spoke of him in hushed tones. The man who struck from nowhere, who left no survivors, who painted his messages in blood. Parents on Earth, secretly, quietly, began to pray for him. Not to God, not to law, but to the fury of one man who refused to let their children be pawns. The galaxy tried to fight back. The Tharix dispatched warships. Patrols doubled. Rewards were offered. Credits, ships, entire colonies for Hale's head. But for every trap they set, another outpost burned. For every reward they offered, another grieving human father slipped into the shadows to join Hale's cause. He never built an army. Armies could be crushed. What he built was worse. Cells of men scattered across the stars, bound only by grief and rage. They struck without warning, vanished without trace, and carried one unspoken creed. No child is safe until all children are safe. Jonathan's transformation was complete the day he returned to Daniel's grave. It was night on Mars, the stars bleeding silver across the black horizon. He stood alone before the small mound of red dust, the wind cold against his skin. "I did what they wouldn't," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I gave them fear. I gave them pain. They'll remember your name, Daniel. They'll remember what happens when they touch us." He dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead against the ground. For the first time in months, he wept, not the broken sobs of a grieving father, but the hard, bitter tears of a man who had become something else. When he rose, there was no trace of softness left in him, only steel. By the end of that year, 6 Therix colonies were gone, 12 freighters, 2 patrol ships. The galaxy bled, and every drop whispered Daniel's name. Earth's leaders tried to stop him. They declared him an outlaw, ordered his capture, branded him a terrorist. But no one succeeded. Because Jonathan Hale was not just one man anymore. He was an idea, and ideas are bulletproof. The galaxy had thought humanity would kneel, that we would play by their rules, that we would cry, then forgive. Instead, we showed them the truth they had always feared. We are the species that survives, the species that fights back, the species that when you hurt one child will make you drown in your own blood. The Therix called him the Butcher of Stars. The Zurin called him the Shadow Father. The Ilari whispered his name like a curse, too afraid to say it aloud. To humanity, he was Jonathan Hale. But to the galaxy, he was something else entirely, a ghost with iron in his blood, grief in his veins, and fire in his hands. By the 3rd year after Daniel's death, his war had grown into something the galaxy could no longer ignore. It began with the Therix. They had underestimated him. They thought Hale was a lone wolf, a broken man lashing out until the void swallowed him. They believed time would smother his fury, that human leaders would leash their own kind before things spiraled out of control. They were wrong. Every strike Hale made was precise, every attack carved into the heart of their empire. He didn't go after the heavily armed warships or fortified stations at first. No, he bled them in the shadows, mining colonies, cargo freighters, remote outposts where complacency reigned. He showed the galaxy that nowhere was safe. The Tharex lost billions in ore shipments. Their supply lines withered. Fear spread among their colonies. Workers refused to travel. Traders avoided their ports. But worse than the economic damage was the psychological scar. The Tharex prided themselves on dominance. They were older, stronger, more technologically advanced. They had looked down on humanity with smug patience, like a teacher tolerating an unruly child. But Hale had flipped the balance. A single human had turned their empire into prey. The humiliation burned deeper than the losses. So they responded. The Tharex assembled a fleet, not a small one, not patrol ships or token escorts, but a war fleet of 40 vessels, armed with weapons that could vaporize cities, their hulls gleaming like obsidian daggers. Their mission was clear: hunt Hale, burn his followers, and drag his corpse before the galaxy as proof that humanity could be cowed. They expected resistance. They expected losses. They did not expect betrayal. Because by the time their fleet reached the asteroid belts near Sol, Hale was waiting, not with one ship, not with a ragtag crew, but with a network of humans who had bled too much to turn back. Dock workers had given him schematics. Smugglers had supplied weapons. Engineers had reprogrammed orbital satellites to serve as mines. And when the Tharex fleet entered the field, Hale's trap closed like a steel fist. The battle lasted 3 days. It wasn't a fair fight. The Tharex had numbers, firepower, experience. But Hale had rage, cunning, and something the Tharex didn't understand: humanity's ability to adapt under fire. His scattered cells of fighters struck from the shadows, vanishing before retaliation. Improvised weapons crippled warships. Hijacked comms turned their coordination into chaos. And every time a human fighter died, 3 more seemed to appear, screaming Daniel's name into the void. When the smoke cleared, 23 Tharex ships lay in ruins. 15 limped away, crippled. 2 surrendered to human raiders rather than burn. The galaxy gasped. One man had brought an empire to its knees, but not everyone celebrated. On Earth, leaders scrambled. The United Earth Council held emergency sessions that lasted for weeks. Some called Hale a hero, a necessary monster who gave the galaxy a taste of its own cruelty. Others called him a terrorist, a danger to humanity's fragile place in the stars. Earth was still young, still struggling to secure its place among older civilizations. The Council feared reprisal, feared that Hale's war would drag their species into extinction. They issued statements condemning him, branding him an outlaw, vowing to assist in his capture. But the people didn't listen. On the streets of New York, banners hung with Hale's face painted in red. On the domes of Mars, parents whispered his name to their children as a promise: "You are not forgotten. You are not weak. You are human." Hale had become more than a man. He had become a myth. And myths cannot be captured. The galaxy took notice. The Zuran Confederacy, the Ilari Syndicate, even the cautious Drethi began to murmur in fear. Hale's vengeance wasn't just a human problem anymore. He had struck Tharex colonies across 3 systems, but his words had spread further than his bullets. If one child is not safe, no child is safe. That phrase echoed in every broadcast, etched onto wreckage, left on the walls of burning colonies. And parents across the galaxy began to wonder, if humans could fight back like this, what else were they capable of? The Zuran sent envoys to Earth, demanding Hale's head. The Ilari threatened sanctions, blockades, even war. But Earth was paralyzed. Officially, they disavowed him. Unofficially, Hale's shadow ran deep in their ranks. Too many soldiers sympathized. Too many officials quietly admired what he'd done. Too many fathers and mothers saw in him the embodiment of their own fears. Jonathan Hale was untouchable. But Hale wasn't blind. He knew the galaxy would tighten its grip. He knew the weight of empires would soon crash upon humanity. He couldn't fight them all. So he changed the game. Instead of striking only the Therics, Hale widened his war. He targeted anyone who aided them, a Zuran freighter carrying weapons, a Yalari station refueling their patrols. He left no ambiguity. "You side with those who kill our children," his messages read, "and you are no different." The galaxy recoiled. Some withdrew their support from the Therics, unwilling to risk Hale's wrath. Others doubled down, pouring resources into hunting him. The effect was the same. Chaos. Trade routes collapsed. Trust between species fractured. Entire sectors descended into fear, all because of one human who refused to forgive. Hale's men changed too. They were no longer the ragged few who boarded freighters in desperation. They were hardened, disciplined, a shadow army spread across the stars. Some cells were small, 5 men with rifles and bombs. Others grew larger, entire ships crewed by those who had lost everything. But they all swore the same oath. No child's blood goes unanswered. Hale didn't call himself their leader. He never wore medals or gave speeches. He wasn't a king or a general. He was simply Jonathan Hale, father of Daniel. And that was enough. When he spoke, men listened. When he gave an order, they obeyed. Not because he demanded loyalty, but because he embodied their pain. He was them. They were him. The galaxy's attempts to kill him became desperate. The Zuran hired assassins. Yalari infiltrators tried to slip poison into his drink. Tharic's soldiers disguised themselves as traitors, waiting for him in shadows. None succeeded. Some failed because Hale was smarter. Others failed because his men were willing to die for him. And some failed because the galaxy itself seemed to conspire in his favor. Systems breaking down. Patrols misfiring. Assassins betrayed by their own greed. With each failure, his legend grew. Children whispered his name. Colonies cursed him in fear. And across Earth, murals bloomed with his face, painted in fire and steel. Jonathan Hale was no longer just a father seeking vengeance. He was the storm, but storms always grow. Hale knew he couldn't remain in the shadows forever. The galaxy would unite. Empires that hated each other would set aside centuries of war just to stop him. And so he began to prepare humanity. Not Earth's government, not the politicians who bowed and scraped for alien approval. Humanity itself. He sent messages not only to his followers, but to entire colonies. Broadcasts slipped into news feeds, encrypted calls whispered into the ears of soldiers, speeches delivered in underground gatherings. They think we are weak, they think we will beg, they think we will kneel, but when they touched one of ours, they showed us their truth. And now we show them ours. His words spread like wildfire. Across the outer colonies, humans armed themselves. Farmers stockpiled rifles. Miners built explosives. Engineers reprogrammed satellites into weapons. The galaxy thought Hale was a lone wolf. Instead, he was building a pack. The climax came when the Tharics announced a decree. Every human settlement in their territory would be evacuated within 30 days. Children would be relocated to secure alien facilities for protection. It was a mistake. The moment the decree reached human ears, Hale responded. His fleet, ragtag, stolen, patched together with fury and desperation, descended on the Therics capital system. Not in secret, not from the shadows, but openly, defiantly. He didn't have enough ships to win. Not in a conventional sense, but he didn't need to win. He needed to send a message. For 7 days, Hale's forces tore through the capital system. Stations burned. Shipyards crumbled. Entire planets were left in darkness. Hale himself led the assault, his flagship crashing through enemy lines like a spear of vengeance. When the Tharic's homeworld itself trembled, Hale broadcast a single message across the galaxy. One human child was hurt. You thought it was nothing. Now your empires bleed, and I will not stop. Not until every child sleeps safe. And the galaxy finally understood. Jonathan Hale was not a man you could kill, not a terrorist you could outlaw, not a criminal you could erase. He was humanity's rage, sharpened into steel, and rage cannot be reasoned with. The galaxy had always spoken of humanity in two tones. At first, it was amusement. The young species, loud and reckless, running headlong into the stars as though they owned them. Children with fire in their hands, the Tharics used to say, bold but harmless. Later, when humanity proved it could fight, when soldiers clawed victory out of impossible odds, when colonies carved homes from unforgiving rock, the tone shifted to caution. Unpredictable, the Zuran muttered. They burned too brightly, too fast. But after Jonathan Hale, there was no amusement, no caution. There was only fear. The siege of the Tharic's capital had not been victory in the traditional sense. Hale's fleet was smaller, his weapons inferior. By all logic, he should have been annihilated in the first day. But logic had no place in Hale's war. He turned supply depots into bombs. He reprogrammed their defense satellites to fire on their own fleets. He jammed communications so entire armadas turned on each other in confusion. By the time the Tharics rallied, their system was burning. Hale pulled back before they could crush him, retreating into the shadows like smoke. But the damage was done. Billions watched as their empire, proud and unyielding, was humiliated by a man with nothing left to lose. And the galaxy trembled. On Earth, the United Council panicked. They gathered in secret chambers beneath the glittering towers of New Geneva, the leaders of humanity's fractured nations bickering like frightened children. Some demanded Hale's head. If humanity was to survive among the stars, they argued, it had to prove it could police its own monsters. Others demanded Earth embrace him, make him a general, turn his legend into a weapon of the state. But no one could agree because no one controlled him. Hale answered to no government, no law, no authority. His war was his own. Bound only to his son's grave and the blood debt written across the stars. And worse, people listened to him more than they listened to their leaders. On Mars, murals of Hale towered over streets, painted in fire and crimson, his face haloed with flames. On Luna, children played games where they pretended to be Hale's raiders, storming alien forts with sticks for rifles. In the outer colonies, men whispered his words like scripture. The council could not bury him. They could not silence him. He was not simply a man. He was the voice of humanity's rage. And that voice was growing louder. In the colonies, Hale's creed spread like wildfire. Farmers on Europa converted their irrigation systems into chemical weapons. Miners on Titan packed explosives into the hulls of their freighters. Shipwrights in the belt built hidden compartments for smuggling arms. Everywhere Hale's words were heard, humanity sharpened itself. Not armies, not governments, people. Ordinary men and women preparing for the day the galaxy came for them. The council tried to stop it. They sent soldiers to seize weapons, dismantle cells, arrest men who whispered Hale's name too loudly. But soldiers were fathers too, brothers, sons. They remembered Daniel. They remembered every insult, every death, every time the galaxy had called them lesser. And many of them laid down their rifles, saluted, and walked away. Some even joined Hale. The galaxy could no longer treat him as an isolated threat. The Tharics demanded extermination. They poured resources into their fleets, urging the Zuran and Ilari to unite against humanity. The Zurin hesitated. They had tasted Hale's wrath already, and knew what it meant to bleed at his hands. The Ilari pressed for war, their voices sharp with fear and pride, and in the shadows, other species watched. Some whispered that Hale had shown humanity's true nature, predators disguised as prey. Others whispered something darker, that perhaps he was right, that the older races had grown arrogant, cruel, careless, that maybe the galaxy needed to bleed. Empires that had stood unchallenged for centuries now eyed each other with suspicion. Alliances cracked, old rivalries flared, all because of one man. Jonathan Hale knew what he had done. He watched the reports with cold eyes from the bridge of his stolen cruiser, his men waiting in silence as flames lit up the screens. He had not destroyed the Therix Empire, not yet. But he had shown the galaxy that their empires were not untouchable. That fear ran both ways. And he knew fear was more powerful than any weapon. He gathered his men in the cargo bay, hundreds of them standing shoulder to shoulder, faces hard, eyes burning. Dockworkers, soldiers, smugglers, fathers. "Look what they do when one of theirs is hurt," Hale said, his voice carrying through the chamber. 40 ships, armies, fleets, all to avenge their pride. "And look what they did when it was one of ours." He let the silence hang. Men clenched their fists. Some wept. They thought Daniel's life was worth nothing. They thought we would kneel, but we showed them. We showed them that one child's blood is worth more than their entire empire. His words were simple, but they carried weight. They weren't speeches written by politicians or polished by diplomats. They were the raw truth of a father who had buried his son. And the men roared. But Hale wasn't blind to the cost. His war had drawn blood, yes, but it had also awakened the galaxy's wrath. Humanity stood on the edge of annihilation. One wrong step, one slip, and entire colonies could be burned. So he turned his fury into something greater. Not just vengeance, not just strikes in the night, but preparation. If the galaxy wanted war, then humanity would be ready. He began building. Not ships. Humanity couldn't match the fleets of the old empires. Not weapons. Not yet. He built will. He forged men into fighters, cells into networks, networks into something stronger. He taught them how to strike, how to vanish, how to bleed an empire without ever facing it head-on. He whispered into the ears of colonists and soldiers alike, turning fear into fire. And slowly, the line between Jonathan Hale the man and Jonathan Hale the myth blurred. He no longer fought alone. Humanity fought with him. The galaxy grew desperate. Assassins hunted him. Fleets chased him. Spies infiltrated his cells. But Hale had become untouchable. Kill one cell, and 3 more rose in its place. Destroy one ship, and another was waiting. And every time the galaxy struck, Hale struck back harder. On New Cestus, where Zurin mercenaries slaughtered human miners, Hale's men leveled the colony in retaliation, leaving behind the words, "An eye for an eye, a child for a child." On Vera Station, where Ilari guards arrested human traitors, Hale hacked the comms and broadcast their executions live, one by one, across every Ilari channel. He gave the galaxy no chance to breathe, no chance to forget. On Earth, the Council broke, half demanded surrender, to hand Hale over to beg forgiveness, to preserve humanity's fragile place. The other half demanded war, to embrace Hale, to prepare for the inevitable storm. But the people had already chosen. When Council soldiers tried to march into colonies to seize Hale's sympathizers, they were met with walls of unarmed men, women, and children. "We are all Jonathan Hale," they shouted. "If you take him, take us too." No government could command against that. And in the shadows of Mars, Luna, Titan, men carried rifles and whispered promises. The galaxy had hurt one child, and humanity was ready to make them pay. Jonathan Hale stood again at his son's grave, the red dust of Mars cold under his boots. He knelt, tracing the small mound with his hands, whispering words no one else would hear. "I did what I promised. Daniel, I made them bleed, but it's not over. It won't be over until every child like you sleeps without fear." He rose, his eyes hard as steel, his face carved by grief and fire. And behind him, stretching into the Martian night, stood hundreds of men waiting for his command. Fathers, brothers, sons. The war was no longer his. It was humanity's. And the galaxy would pay. The first strikes didn't come quietly. The Thariks never acted quietly. Their warships tore into human space like knives, black hulls gleaming under distant suns. Whole colonies went dark in hours. Orbital stations were slagged, burned until they were nothing but floating wreckage. The galaxy had watched Hale grow into a legend and had done nothing. Too afraid, too divided. But now the Thariks moved, and their message was simple. If humanity wanted to bleed the stars, then humanity would drown in its own blood. They didn't target soldiers. They didn't target Hale's fighters. They went for the weak, civilians, families, children. It was supposed to break humanity. It was supposed to scare them into turning on Hale, into begging their leaders to give him up. Instead, it set the galaxy on fire. Jonathan Hale was in the belt when the first attacks came. His ship, the Scourge, intercepted fragments of transmissions, Mars burning, Titan screaming, stations along the Europa Rim collapsing into flame. He didn't speak for a long time. His crew watched him, their faces pale, waiting. When he finally turned, his eyes were steel. "They've declared war on all of us," he said. "Then let's show them what war really means." The Thariks believed they were waging a campaign of terror. In truth, they had lit a fuse. Every colony that burned, every settlement that screamed under their bombardments, only added fuel to Hale's fire. Men who once hesitated now picked up rifles. Mothers strapped bombs to their freighters. Children painted Hale's face on walls and whispered his name like a prayer. Humanity wasn't broken. It was enraged. And rage is the one weapon no empire can control. The council tried to hold the line. In New Geneva, the chambers shook with shouting. "We can't fight them," one delegate screamed. "They'll crush us." "They already are," another roared back. "Hale warned us this would happen, and we ignored him." Old divisions fractured further. Some nations called for surrender. Others demanded total war. The council issued orders to arrest Hale, to dismantle his networks, to disavow him in every public channel. But no one listened. The soldiers meant to enforce those orders found themselves standing in front of crowds chanting Hale's name. The colonies refused to obey. Even in Earth's own cities, thousands marched in the streets, banners of Hale's words hanging from skyscrapers. "One child was hurt. You will all pay." The council was powerless. They ruled on paper. Hale ruled in blood. The retaliation began with raids. Hale's cells struck back against Thariks convoys, turning supply lines into graveyards. They mined jump points, ambushed transports, poisoned food shipments. Every attack was followed by the same message, burned into comms or painted in blood. "You kill our children, we kill yours." The Thariks doubled down. More fleets, more fire. They leveled colonies until ash floated in orbit. But they couldn't be everywhere. And everywhere they weren't, Hale's vengeance burned. The turning point came at Elysium Station. It was one of humanity's largest settlements, a city suspended above Saturn's rings, home to hundreds of thousands. The Thariks descended on it with an armada, vowing to erase it as a warning. Hale got there first. He didn't have a fleet large enough to meet them head-on. He didn't need one. He had men who no longer feared death. He had engineers who turned cargo haulers into battering rams, miners who wired asteroids with explosives, pilots who would rather burn than kneel. When the Therix fleet arrived, the void lit up with fire. Elysium's defenders fought like wolves. Civilian freighters rammed warships. Asteroids detonated in waves of shrapnel, tearing through hulls. Hale's flagship pierced their lines like a spear, his men boarding ship after ship in brutal silence. The Tharix expected fear. Instead, they found savagery. For 3 days the battle raged. By the end, half the Therix fleet was gone. The other half limped away, broken. Elysium still stood, scarred, bloodied, burning, but alive. The news spread like wildfire. A human colony had stood against the full fury of the Therix Empire, and survived. It was more than victory. It was proof. Proof that humanity could fight. Proof that Hale's war was not madness. Proof that the galaxy had underestimated the species it once called children. The galaxy reeled. The Zuran Council demanded peace talks. The Ilari threatened to join the war, but their words rang hollow. Even their citizens had begun whispering Hale's name. Other species, smaller ones long oppressed by empires like the Therix, began to watch humanity with new eyes. They saw in Hale not just vengeance, but possibility. If humans could stand against the old powers, maybe they could too. Hale had lit more than a war. He had lit rebellion. But Hale himself was not blinded by glory. He stood on the wreckage of a Therix battleship orbiting Elysium, the stench of blood and fire heavy in the air. His men cheered around him, raising rifles, chanting his name, but his eyes were fixed on the stars, cold, calculating. "They'll come again," he said quietly to his second-in-command, a scarred Marine named Garrick. "They'll come with more ships, more fire. They won't stop until we're ash." "Then we'll fight them again," Garrick said. Hale shook his head. "No, fighting isn't enough. They think this is war. They haven't seen war yet. We'll show them. We'll make their children wake screaming. We'll make their empires crumble. Not because we're stronger, but because we'll never stop." His voice was calm, deadly, the voice of a man who had buried his son and found no bottom to his rage. The war changed after Elysium. No longer was it Hale striking from the shadows. No longer was it a question of whether humanity would fight. Humanity was at war. Every colony became a fortress. Every freighter became a weapon. Children learned to load rifles before they learned to read. The Council tried to regain control, but it was too late. Hale had become the beating heart of human defiance. When he spoke, the colonies listened. When he commanded, men obeyed. He never claimed power. He never wore medals. But power bent to him anyway, because he was the only one the galaxy feared. The Therix escalated. They brought in allies, mercenaries, entire fleets from races too weak to resist their pressure. The war spread across systems like wildfire. But Hale escalated too. He unleashed tactics the galaxy had never seen. Suicide freighters loaded with chemical warheads. Viral codes that turned enemy AI against their masters. Boarding squads who didn't stop at surrender but left entire crews crucified on the hulls of their ships. It wasn't war, it was terror. And the galaxy began to break. On Earth, the people changed. The fear that once bound them to alien approval was gone. Instead, they looked to the stars with cold determination. No more begging for acceptance. No more treaties written in alien ink. They were human, and they would not kneel. Hale's face hung over cities like a prophet's. His words were etched into walls, whispered in markets, printed in books. One child was hurt. You thought it meant nothing. Now it means everything. The Tharics made one last gamble. They assembled the largest fleet in their history, a coalition of allies, mercenaries, conscripts, a wall of steel and fire meant to end humanity in a single blow. They marched toward Sol, promising to burn Earth itself. Hale was waiting. He didn't have enough ships to meet them head-on, but he didn't need to. He had turned the entire system into a trap. Asteroids mined, satellites armed, moons wired with explosives, stations reprogrammed to serve as weapons. Every inch of Sol was sharpened into a blade. When the coalition entered, the system erupted. Fleets shattered. Stations tore apart enemy hulls. Moons detonated in firestorms. Hale's ships darted through the chaos, striking, vanishing, striking again. It was not a battle, it was slaughter. The coalition broke. The survivors fled. Sol still stood. And the galaxy realized the unthinkable. Humanity had faced the full weight of their empires. And lived. Jonathan Hale stood in the command deck of the Scourge, watching the wreckage of alien fleets drift through the black. His crew cheered, some weeping, others howling with triumph. But Hale did not smile. He only whispered to himself, to his son's memory, "This is only the beginning." The silence after the Battle of Sol was worse than the noise. For days, the wreckage of the coalition fleet drifted through the system. Shattered hulls, torn limbs, twisted metal gleaming under the pale light of distant stars. The void was a graveyard, and the dead outnumbered the living by millions. But humanity still stood. Against every prediction, against every law of logic, against every arrogant prophecy from the older races, Earth was alive. Mars was alive. The colonies were scarred, bloodied, but unbroken, and Jonathan Hale was still breathing. The galaxy had tried to end him. They had thrown fleets, assassins, blockades, every tool in their arsenal. He should have died 100 times over. Instead, he had turned the cradle of humanity into a fortress and carved entire empires into bleeding carcasses. The galaxy expected Earth to celebrate. But there was no celebration. There was only silence. And in that silence, rage burned hotter than ever. Hale stood at the viewport of the Scourge, staring at the wreckage scattered across Sol. Garrick, his scarred second-in-command, stepped beside him, carrying a flask. "You won," Garrick said quietly. "You proved them wrong. For once, we survived." Hale didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the drifting hulks of alien ships. "We didn't win," he said. "Not yet. As long as they draw breath, they'll come back. And next time, they'll burn everything." Garrick took a drink, then offered the flask. Hale didn't touch it. "So what now?" Garrick asked. Hale finally turned. His eyes were hollow, but fire still burned within. "Now," he said, "we stop waiting for them to come. We take the war to them." It began with whispers. Cells scattered across human colonies received new orders. No more waiting, no more hiding. They would strike into alien space itself. Not just freighters and outposts, but core worlds, fortified stations, cities that had never known fear. The galaxy thought humans were still too weak, too fractured, too primitive to invade. They were wrong. Humanity didn't need fleets as large as theirs. They didn't need empires. They had something stronger, fury sharpened into precision, and Jonathan Hale was its blade. The first strike fell on the Ilari. For years, they had mocked humans as upstarts, sneering at treaties while secretly funneling weapons to the Tharics. Their stations brimmed with wealth stolen from colonies too weak to resist. Their people lived in luxury, untouched by war, until Hale arrived. The Scourge led the assault on Ilari Prime's orbital ring. Hale's raiders hit with brutal speed, planting charges, seizing weapons, turning the station into a tomb. When the Ilari fleet scrambled to respond, they found their engines sabotaged, their comms fried, their orbital defenses hacked to fire on their own cities. By the time they restored order, half their fleet was gone. The orbital ring was rubble. Millions were dead. And across their networks, Hale's voice broadcast clear and sharp. "You thought our children were weak. Now yours scream in the dark." The Ilari howled for vengeance. Their leaders vowed to erase humanity, to scour Earth from the stars. But their people trembled. For the first time in centuries, they weren't safe. Then came the Zurin. The Zurin had tried to stay neutral, but neutrality is weakness in war. They allowed Tharic's ships to refuel, to pass through their space. That was enough. Hale's men infiltrated their capital world, disguising themselves as traitors. They planted bombs in the heart of the Zurin Senate. When the bombs detonated, the capital burned for 3 days. The Zurin leaders survived, most of them. But their citizens, their civilians, their children, they weren't spared. And again, Hale left a message carved into the ruins. "You let them kill our sons. Now yours die too." The galaxy called it madness, monstrous, evil, but Hale didn't care. He wasn't fighting for their approval. He wasn't fighting for politics, for treaties, for peace. He was fighting for Daniel, for every child whose name had been written off as an unfortunate accident. And for that, he would burn the galaxy. Humanity followed. At first it was only Hale's raiders, the hardened men who had stood with him from the beginning. But as the war spread, more joined. Colonists, soldiers, smugglers, fathers who had buried children, mothers who had lost sons. Entire fleets rose under his banner. Not government fleets, not sanctioned armies, people's fleets. Rusted freighters turned into warships, mining rigs converted into carriers, civilian craft armed with stolen cannons. They were crude, they were ugly, but they were relentless. And they followed Hale without question, not because he commanded them, but because he was them. On Earth, the council collapsed. They tried to issue decrees, to claim authority, to call for restraint. But no one listened. Their soldiers deserted. Their colonies ignored them. Even their citizens spat on their names. When the council tried to negotiate with the galaxy, Hale intercepted the transmission and replaced it with his own broadcast. "You don't speak for us anymore. You never did. Humanity speaks through blood now, and I am its voice." The council was finished. Humanity no longer had politicians. It had Hale. The galaxy united at last, not out of pride, but out of desperation. The Tharics, the Ilari, the Zurin, and a dozen smaller empires gathered fleets larger than anything seen in centuries. They swore to end Hale, to end humanity, to crush the species that dared to defy them. But Hale was ready. He didn't wait for them to come. He struck first. The war was no longer one of raids and shadows. It was open. Entire sectors burned. At Vera Prime, Hale's fleets shattered 3 enemy armadas, leaving the skies filled with drifting corpses. At Carthus Reach, Hale's men boarded a Tharix dreadnought, slaughtered its crew, and used it as a weapon against their own fleet. At the Zurin frontier, Hale's raiders poisoned entire supply chains, leaving millions starving. It wasn't war. It was extermination. But Hale wasn't just killing. He was teaching. Every strike carried a lesson. You can't hurt humanity without paying. You can't dismiss us, ignore us, mock us. Not anymore. For every human child buried, 10 alien children would follow. And slowly, horribly, the galaxy began to understand. Not everyone in humanity agreed. There were those who whispered that Hale had gone too far, that vengeance had become cruelty, that he was turning humans into monsters no better than the empires they fought. but their voices were drowned out. Because most humans didn't see cruelty. They saw justice. For generations, they had been laughed at, dismissed, treated as lesser. Now the galaxy bled at their hands. Now their children walked taller. Now humanity was feared. And fear was respect. Jonathan Hale stood again at his son's grave. Mars was quiet, the red dust swirling under the pale light of stars. He knelt, pressing a hand against the mound. His voice was low, steady. "They're learning, Daniel. Every scream, every fire, they're learning. They thought we were weak. They thought we would kneel, but now they know. They know we're human, and that means we never stop." Behind him, ships lifted into the sky, fleets painted with the scars of battle. Men and women armed to the teeth, ready to follow him into the heart of the galaxy. Jonathan Hale rose, his eyes hard as steel, his voice carrying into the night. "This isn't vengeance anymore. This is survival. This is justice. And if the galaxy wants blood, we'll give it to them until the stars drown in it." The men roared, their voices shaking the Martian dust, and Hale, father of one dead child, led humanity into the dark. The war no longer belonged to the shadows. In the early years, Hale had fought like a ghost, hit-and-run strikes, sabotage, whispers carried through wreckage. But by the 7th year of his crusade, there was no mistaking it. This was no longer the story of one father's grief. It was humanity's war of survival. And the galaxy was losing. It began with Darshek IV, a Zuran colony world, thick with jungle and oceans that glowed under twin moons. For centuries, it had thrived as a jewel of their empire, a world of scholars, artists, philosophers, a place untouched by war. Until Hale arrived. His fleets cut through the Zuran patrols like knives through paper. His raiders fell upon the cities, not with hesitation, not with mercy, but with fury sharpened by years of blood. The Zuran begged for quarter. They raised their hands. They offered surrender. Hale gave them nothing. By the time his ships departed, Darshek IV was ash. Its jungles burned, its oceans boiled, its cities reduced to rubble. The galaxy called it genocide. Hale called it justice. From Darshek, the war spread. The Ilari tried to hold their borders, tightening defenses around their core worlds. Hale broke them anyway. At Mirrodin Station, his men breached the orbital defenses with jury-rigged freighters packed with explosives. They docked, detonated, and tore the ring apart from within. Half the Ilari fleet was caught in the blast. The survivors limped away, broken. The Thariks were worse. They refused to bend, throwing fleet after fleet at Hale's forces. Each time, they lost more. The galaxy began to whisper the unthinkable. The old empires might fall, and humanity, the upstarts, the children, the young ones, might rise in their place. But Hale didn't seek an empire. He sought ruin. He stood on the bridge of the Scourge, watching as Darshek's burning remains turned in the void. Garrick approached, his face hard. "They're saying we're monsters now," Garrick said. "Even some of our own." Hale didn't answer. "You hear me?" Garrick pressed. "Civilians, families, we're killing them too." Finally, Hale turned. His eyes were cold steel. "They killed Daniel," he said, "and they called it an accident. They laughed in our faces. They buried our children in the dirt and told us to be grateful they didn't take more. Do you think they care about ours? Do you think they'd hesitate?" Garrick didn't answer. He didn't need to. Hale turned back to the viewport. "They brought this war to our children. Now every child of theirs will learn what it feels like." The galaxy tried to fight back, but Hale had changed the rules. The old empires fought with fleets, with armies, with banners raised high. They fought wars of pride, of conquest, of treaties and borders. Hale fought with hate. He turned entire asteroid fields into minefields. He infected supply chains with plagues engineered from Earth's deadliest viruses. He unleashed suicide fleets that hurled themselves into enemy capitals, detonating nuclear fire across their skies. It wasn't war, it was terror made flesh, and the galaxy was drowning in it. But even as humanity burned worlds, fractures grew. Some colonies whispered that Hale had gone too far, that vengeance had swallowed justice, that the man who had once fought for his son was now little more than a butcher. On Earth, a faction rose calling themselves the Concord. They argued for peace, for an end to the blood. They sent envoys to alien leaders, begging for negotiations, promising that not all humans followed Hale. The envoys never returned. Their ships were found drifting in the void, gutted, their crews crucified on the hulls. Hale never claimed responsibility, but everyone knew. "You can't negotiate with wolves," he said when asked. "You either kill them or you starve them." And so the Concord died. But for every voice that cried peace, 10 more cried for vengeance. Humanity had tasted fear once, and it had sworn never to taste it again. On Mars, shipyards worked day and night, spitting out freighters turned warships. On Luna, children trained with rifles in their hands. In the Belt, miners turned drills into cannons. The galaxy had unleashed something it could no longer cage. And at its heart was Jonathan Hale. The galaxy began to break. The Zuran Confederacy collapsed first. Their senate was bombed to ruin, their fleets shattered, their colonies gutted one by one. Refugees fled into Ilari space, but found no safety there. Hale's fleets followed, relentless. The Ilari cracked next. Their proud navy, once the jewel of the stars, was torn apart battle by battle until only scraps remained. Their worlds burned. Their leaders begged for mercy. Hale gave them none. The Therics held longest. Their empire had always been cruel, hardened by centuries of conquest. But cruelty means nothing when every colony becomes a battlefield, every freighter a bomb, every moon a mine. By the time Hale's fleets reached their homeworld, the Therics were already starving. And still, he did not stop. Yet even Hale's men began to wonder. One night, aboard the Scourge, Garrick confronted him again. "You've won," Garrick said. "The galaxy's broken. The empires are ashes. There's nothing left to fight." Hale stared at him in silence. "You hear me?" Garrick pressed. "It's over. You can stop." But Hale's eyes burned. "It will never be over," he said. "Because Daniel is still in the ground, and as long as he's there, as long as one of ours lies buried because of them, it will never end." Garrick's voice cracked. "You're not fighting for Daniel anymore. You're fighting because you don't know how to stop." Hale turned away. His silence was answer enough. The galaxy called him the Reaper of Stars. Entire species fled before his fleets. Worlds surrendered without a shot, their leaders bowing in fear, begging for clemency. None came. Hale's war had become more than vengeance. It was annihilation, and humanity followed. Because they were tired of being prey, tired of bowing, tired of burying their children while the galaxy smirked. They didn't want peace anymore. They wanted dominance. By the end of the 7th year, the map of the stars was unrecognizable. The Zuran were gone. The Ilari shattered. The Tharics broken. Dozens of lesser races scattered, their worlds burned or abandoned. And in their place stood humanity, not an empire, not a council, not a government, but a fire. And Jonathan Hale was its flame. He stood once more at his son's grave. The Martian dust cold under his boots. He knelt, tracing the mound with calloused hands, his voice a whisper in the silence. "I burned them for you, Daniel, every last one. I gave them your pain. I gave them your scream. I gave them your blood 1,000 times over." He rose, his eyes on the stars, and his voice was cold as death. But it's still not enough. The stars had gone quiet. Once the galaxy had been a chorus of empires, the Ilari's proud fleets, the Zurin's endless councils, the Tharix's thunderous war machines. Now their voices were silent, their banners burned, their worlds turned to ash. Humanity stood alone in the dark, but it did not stand untouched. Whole generations had known nothing but war. Children learned to load rifles before they could walk. Cities were built not for beauty but for defense. Entire colonies were scarred, poisoned, hollowed. The galaxy had paid for Daniel Hale's death. It had paid in blood, in fire, in ruin. And still, Jonathan Hale could not stop. He stood on the bridge of the Scourge, staring at the holographic map of the stars, where once the empires had glowed in color, now only black scars marked where his fleets had passed. "Nothing left," Garrick muttered. His voice was rough, weary. "They're broken, Hale. The Zurin gone, the Ilari scattered, the Tharix starving in their ruins." "You've won." Hale didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the map, cold, calculating. "There's always something left," Hale said. Garrick slammed his fist against the console. "Listen to yourself. You've already buried half the galaxy. How much more blood before it's enough?" Hale turned then, his face carved with lines of steel. "Daniel's still in the ground," he said quietly. "Until he rises, it will never be enough." Garrick's voice cracked. "Then you'll burn until there's nothing left but ash." "Then so be it," Hale whispered. But even Hale could not fight forever. His fleets were stretched thin, his men were weary. For every world he burned, more rose in rebellion. Not aliens, but humans. Colonists who whispered that they wanted peace, who said Hale's war had turned them into the very monsters they once feared. And on Earth, deep beneath New Geneva, a new council was rising. Not the weak politicians of the old days, but hardened men and women forged in war. They admired Hale. They thanked him for what he had done. But they also feared him. Because Jonathan Hale was no longer a savior, he was a storm that would never end. And storms, no matter how powerful, eventually destroy everything, even those they were meant to protect. The final clash came not from the galaxy, but from humanity itself. It began with whispers, colonies refusing Hale's orders, fleets pulling away from his command, voices demanding an end. Hale ignored them. He pushed forward, striking deeper into the void, searching for the next target, the next empire to bleed. But when his fleets arrived, they found no enemy, only silence. And in that silence, humanity's ships turned their guns inward. The Battle of Titan was not alien against human. It was human against human. On one side, Hale, his raiders, the men who had followed him since Daniel's grave was fresh, hardened, merciless, unyielding. On the other, fleets of Earth and Mars, colonists who had risen under his shadow but now sought to step out from it. Soldiers who had once whispered his name with reverence, but now whispered it with fear. The void lit up with fire. Brother turned on brother. Ships that had once fought side by side now tore each other apart. The battle raged for 3 days, and the stars above Titan burned red with human blood. At its heart, aboard the Scourge, Jonathan Hale watched his war tear his people apart. And for the first time in years, he hesitated. Garrick found him in the command chamber, the walls trembling under bombardment. "This is it," Garrick said. His face was pale, his voice hoarse. "It's over. You can still stop it. You can still give them peace." Hale's hands trembled against the console. Images of Daniel flickered in his mind, his laugh, his eyes, the way he'd clung to his hand before that final trip. "Peace," Hale whispered. The word tasted foreign, bitter. "You've already given him vengeance," Garrick pressed. "More than any father ever could. Let that be enough." Hale closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he let himself remember not the scream, not the coffin, but the boy. The boy who had wanted to see the stars, not burn them, and something inside him broke. When the scourge transmitted its final message, the entire galaxy listened. Jonathan Hale's face appeared, worn, scarred, his eyes hollow but clear. "I began this war as a father," he said. His voice was steady, heavy with the weight of years. "One child was hurt, and the galaxy thought it meant nothing, so I made them pay, and they paid in blood." He paused, his jaw tight. "But vengeance has no end. It consumes until there's nothing left. I see that now. I see what I've turned us into." He leaned closer, his eyes piercing through every screen, every comm. "Remember this. Humanity will never kneel again. Not to the Thariks, not to the Ilari, not to anyone. We are not prey. We are not children. We are the fire in the dark. And if you ever touch one of ours again, the stars themselves will drown in your blood." His voice cracked. "Just once. And Daniel, I hope you can forgive me." The transmission cut. A moment later, the scourge plunged into Titan's atmosphere, its reactors overloading. The sky lit with fire as the ship tore itself apart, a star born in the methane clouds. Jonathan Hale was gone. The war did not end that day. Wars never end in a single moment. But something shifted. Without Hale, the fire of vengeance cooled. Humanity, still hardened, still fierce, began to rebuild. Colonies rebuilt cities. Shipyards turned back to trade. Children were taught not just to fight, but to dream. But the galaxy never forgot. The ruins of the Ilari still smoked. The Thariks never rose again. The Zurin remained scattered shadows. And across the stars, one phrase was carved into memory, whispered from parent to child, etched into monuments of ash and steel. One human child was hurt. The galaxy paid in blood. Years later, on Mars, a boy stood at a grave. The dust swirled around him as he traced the name carved in stone: Daniel Hale. Beside it, another marker stood. No body, just words. Jonathan Hale. Father, Avenger, Fire of Humanity. The boy's father, a soldier, knelt beside him. "Who was he?" the boy asked softly. The father stared at the names, his voice heavy. "A man who lost everything. A man who made the galaxy remember what it means to hurt us. A man who gave us fear and freedom." The boy frowned. Was he a hero? The father's eyes darkened. Heroes build. Hale destroyed. He wasn't a hero. He was a warning. The boy nodded, though he didn't understand. Not yet. But he would. Because every human child grew up knowing the story of Jonathan Hale. The man who turned grief into fire. The father who burned the galaxy. The storm that taught the stars to fear. And somewhere, in the silence between stars, the echo of his voice still lingered. One child was hurt. You will all pay.